Okay, I think I'll get started just because we've got people streaming, and so we don't want to leave them hanging, even though we may have some stragglers, as we usually do. So I think I know all of you. I'm Katie Radis, employment attorney. At any rate, so what we're talking about today, this is the second series in our Payroll Basics class. And last time we talked about what laws actually apply, and that's sort of the initial question. How do I figure out what I owe? You have to first decide, well, is this an employee? Are you an employer? And that kind of stuff. What we're going to be talking about today is the hour part. When I say wage and hour law, there's sort of two different considerations. The first one is, how much do I have to pay? What amounts are owed? But the other piece of that is, what do I actually have to pay for? And that's what we're going to be talking about today, the hour piece. What time is actually compensable? Okay, and there's a lot of sort of little nuances in the law, whether it's travel time or somebody being on call or someone's at work but they haven't clocked in yet, all those kinds of things that come up when we talk about which hours actually need to be compensated. The other piece to that that sort of is linked to the wage part is which hours need to be compensated at the overtime rate. Okay, and we're going to kind of talk about that a little more next week when we get into the wage part. But for right now, what we're talking about when we think of hour basics is what time do we actually have to pay for. And this slide here goes through all of the pieces that we're going to talk about. When I say hour issues, what are hours worked? What is compensable time? Okay. What about meal and rest breaks? When do you have to pay for those? When's an on-duty meal period okay? So that you pay for the time, but you don't have to pay the penalty, all that kind of stuff. And then what I call special considerations. These are sort of special time frames that you may or may not have to pay for, depending upon the circumstances and what the person's doing. And then finally, tracking time, because of course we can only pay for what we know we have to pay for. And so there's that problem of, oh shucks, I have no timesheet for this person, or here's a timesheet and guess what, it's not filled out at all, or the supervisor filled it out instead of the employee. And so all of those issues that come up. And one of the big things when we talk about tracking time is the fact that it's the employer's responsibility to have accurate time records. Okay, so if you end up with a claim and you're sitting in front of the Department of Labor, or you're sitting in front of the Labor Commissioner, and you say, well, I didn't pay them because they didn't turn in their timesheet, it's not their job to turn in the timesheet. It's your job to have those accurate time records. Okay, and so how do you get those accurate time records? That's a performance issue. This is one of their essential job duties, is to turn in that timesheet. Okay, we don't discipline people with their pay. We discipline them by counseling them and writing them up and eventually terminating them. If they're never turning in a timesheet, they're creating huge liability for your company, and you need to address that, and that's a performance issue. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. But this is just an outline of what we're going to go through over the next hour. And again, whatever questions you have, this is a mostly friendly group. If you don't count Wendy. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's a pretty friendly group. Honestly, whatever questions you guys might have, please just shout them out. Okay, so hours worked. I talked last time about there's federal law and there's state law. And hours worked, the concept of what time is compensable, is defined a little differently under federal law than it is under state law. Under federal law, from the regulations, we get this definition: all time during which an employee is required to be on duty or on the employer's premises or at a workplace, and time when the employee is suffered or permitted to work, whether or not they're required to actually work, suffered or permitted. And what they mean by that is whether or not the person's actually working or not. If you have control over them, you're telling them to be there. I could come to this seminar and stand here and not say a word, okay? But I'm required to be here, and that would be enough to make this time compensable, even if I'm not actually doing the work. Okay, if I'm suffered, permitted, allowed to work. Okay, that's our federal definition. Under California, we also have that suffered and permitted definition. Okay, if you're under the control, if you're someplace that the employer wants you to be, is requiring you to be. Okay, but we also have this subject to the control of the employer piece, and that's where we get a little bit. If you have an employee who, for example, reports to they have an off-site job, and so they report to a central location, and everybody has to get on the van, and then the van goes out to the work site. Maybe it's a lease where they don't want a lot of cars out there, and so we're going to make everybody drive and shuttle together in this one van. When you tell that employee they have to get on that van, once they get into that van and they're listening to their iPod and they're playing on their phone, okay, they're subject to your control. They're no longer in control of where they go okay? And that makes that time compensable, even though they're not necessarily working at that time. Okay, it's a very broad definition, all right? And some of the things that we're starting to see that have come up, especially with the, rampant use of phones, is when you have that phone that now turns time that wouldn't be compensable into hours worked. There was a case about 3 years ago, this LoJack guy who, would load the LoJacks into all the cars, and then he'd go home at the end of the day and upload that data to the, the mothership LoJack, whatever, spaceship in the sky, whatever. But as his computer is uploading all that data, okay, and he's on the couch drinking a beer watching TV, all of a sudden that time was compensable, okay? The computer was doing the work, but it was something that the employer was benefiting from, subject permitted, or suffered and permitted to work, subject to the control of the employer. So that's the stuff we want to watch for. Very broad definition. And remember, when you mess up, when it comes to identifying those compensable hours, okay, this is where a whole string of penalties are going to get triggered. Because if you don't pay them for those hours, gee, their pay stub, their wage statement's all wrong because it doesn't identify the accurate hours. Oh, you also have a time card issue because you don't have accurate time records. Oh, well, shucks, you might not have paid the overtime because you didn't know that there were these hours to be paid also. So you get penalty on top of penalty on top of penalty, and all of a sudden, shoot, we underpaid this guy by $8. He makes $8 an hour, and we are going to end up owing $8,000 in penalties. That's how this stuff tends to play out. Okay, so how many hours did the employee actually work? Okay, the critical piece in that is when we talk about the overtime obligations, you owe overtime typically if they work over 8 hours in a day or over 40 hours in a week. So we need to know what those hours worked are so that we can decide when you've crossed over that 8-hour threshold or that 40-hour threshold. And that's one of the key things in figuring out how much you're going to end up owing. Okay. So we start with this general principle. If you're suffered, permitted to work, allowed to work, under the employer's control, we're going to consider that time to be compensable. We're going to pay you for that time. Okay, I get these calls all the time. Well, we're having a holiday party, and I told people they don't have to go, and is this something I have to pay for? Well, is this something that's truly voluntary, or is this something that you're insinuating, implying, sort of tacitly encouraging them to go? Is this something where they're going to be penalized, or they feel like they're going to be penalized if they don't go? And if that's the case, it may be that they need to be compensated for that. Okay? Or if you have the person who says, hey, I love to plan parties, I'm going to volunteer to plan the party. The employer's getting a benefit out of that. If they're planning it during the workday and that sort of thing, it's probably going to be something that you're going to have to compensate for. That rule against unauthorized overtime versus enforcement, I see this all the time, and almost every handbook that I do for my clients says, employees, non-exempt employees are not allowed to work overtime unless they've previously gotten approval from their supervisor. Okay, great. We don't want your non-exempt people just out, working 12 hours every night, in the middle of the night, okay, because we want to try and keep control over those overtime costs. That's all fine and good, but when the employee turns in that time card that says, guess what, I have insomnia and I worked for 12 hours last night instead of sleeping, okay, you don't get to not pay them, even though they didn't have permission to work those hours, even though they were told that that's not against our policy. We don't get to punish people with that paycheck. So what do you do when that person shows up and says, sorry, I'm a workaholic, insomniac? Yeah, you write them up, exactly. This is a performance issue. If I've got non-exempt staff and they're working at times when they're not scheduled to work, they're working off the clock, they're using their phone, whether it's on their meal break or it's on the weekend, okay, they're creating risk, they're creating cost, they're creating exposure for us, and that's a performance issue. Okay, it can be a little difficult to write those people up, okay, because the person who's up working 12 hours a night, okay, is your good worker. Okay, they care about the job and they're doing a good job and they're trying really hard. Okay, this is an education and a training issue. All right, so it sometimes can be a little difficult, at least, to write those people up. Okay, meal and rest breaks, and we talked about this a little bit last time, but the big key with the meal and rest breaks is, well, there's two pieces. Okay, there's the time that the person takes the meal. Okay, that time when they're away from work. If they're actually away from work and they're not working, we don't pay for that time. Meal breaks are typically unpaid. Okay, some employers may have a policy where they're going to pay through the meal break. But the law doesn't require that, okay? The other piece of the meal break is the penalty. There's an additional hour of pay that is owed, and that's to be paid at the employee's regular rate of pay, which we'll talk about next time. How do you calculate that regular rate of pay? What does that mean? An additional hour of pay that's owed in the case that the employee is not provided with an opportunity to take that meal period, okay? And when we say not provided with an opportunity, what I mean is that the employer does something to prevent that employee from taking that meal break, whether it's having a policy that no one's allowed to take meal breaks, okay, or whether it's scheduling everybody so that that person can never get a break, whether it's saying this project needs to be done by 1, you better have it finished and on my desk. All of those actions can be construed as the employer preventing that meal period, okay? The other little caveat there is it's not enough to just say, yeah, you can take a meal period, okay? You have to tell them, yes, you can take the meal period before the end of the 5th hour of work, okay? So if you say, yeah, you can take a meal period, but you can't take it till 2 because I need that project done, if you've prevented them within that first 5 hours from taking that meal break, that's when that penalty is going to get triggered, okay? And we got this from a big case that came out a few years ago called Brinker. Probably you guys have heard of that. And that case really looked at, in the wage orders and in the labor code, it says you need to provide a meal period. Okay, and the labor commissioner had taken the stance that provide means the employer needs to ensure that that meal period is taken. So they would look at the timesheets, oh look, you know, there was no meal break, okay, the employer didn't ensure it, there's liability. And what the court said is, no, when we say you need to provide a meal period, we mean you need to give them a real opportunity to go and take that meal break. Okay, and as long as you give them that opportunity, you don't prevent it, you don't impede it, you don't discourage it. If they voluntarily elect to work through lunch and not take the meal break, that penalty is not going to be triggered. Okay? It doesn't mean that you don't have to pay them for that time when they're working. You know, there's the two pieces. There's the penalty and then there's the time that they work. If they voluntarily choose to work through that meal break, we owe them compensation for each minute of that meal break that they're working. We just don't also owe that penalty. Yeah, Rolando.
What about accommodations for them to go eat?
Accommodations for them to do what? I'm not.
To go eat, like just give them the time to go eat. There is no tables, there is no nothing for them to go actually.
Yeah. Well, they need to be allowed to leave the workplace, okay, for that during that meal break, and if you have somebody who's working a graveyard shift, you also need to provide an accommodation, a table, kitchen, room, place for them to be able to go and sit down and eat where they're removed from the workplace. That accommodation piece, though, only kicks in for people who are working a graveyard shift. For everybody else, look, you're free to go, you know. Where it gets a little dicey, though, is, and I've got a lot of clients that have this situation, you've got people out on an oil rig. Okay, well, yeah, sure, you can leave for a 30-minute lunch break, but you've got to swim to shore. I mean, you know, can they really take a lunch break? You know, as a practical matter, no, you know. They swim partway there, and they got to turn around and swim back because their 30 minutes is up. I mean, so that's where it gets a little dicey. And there are some exceptions under those wage orders for things you can do and whether that penalty gets triggered. But you don't generally have to provide them with, you know, a kitchen or an eating room. Okay. So what after Brinker, and it's kind of interesting because Brinker went up, it was a big class action about these meal and rest periods, and then they said, well, you just have to make sure they have an opportunity to take the meal period. So it went all the way back down to the trial court. You know, they had gotten all the way up to the California Supreme Court, went all the way back down to the trial court, and the trial court just about 2 months ago recertified that class action and said, okay, it's going to get to go forward because they didn't have a policy that said, we provide you with that opportunity before the end of the 5th hour. So they said your policy overall was not correct. And because that policy overall was not correct, it applied to everybody, this gets to go forward as a class action. So it'll be interesting to see how that case plays out. But the key after that decision is you only need to provide them with an opportunity to take that meal period. Okay, it needs to start before the end of the 5th hour. That opportunity for them to take it needs to start before the end of the 5th hour. And what you really want to watch for is your frontline supervisors, that they aren't, you know, doing that wink and a nod of, oh, you're taking your meal break? You know, that sends the message that, okay, this is not okay. I have a lot of clients that, and this happens a lot in the restaurant industry, okay? The employee doesn't want to take the break, okay, because they want to keep getting paid, all right? And that's fine. If the employee voluntarily elects to, you know, forego that break, that's fine. What you want to have is on your timesheet a little thing that says, you know, by signing here, I confirm that my employer authorized and allowed me to take a meal break, blah, blah, blah. Any time when I was prevented from taking the meal break because of my employer's actions or my supervisor's actions, I've informed my supervisor and told them. Yeah?
What if you have employees that decide not to take breaks, not to take the lunch period 2 weeks early?
Yeah. Well, that comes down to a business decision. You're still allowed as the employer to set a schedule out. You're going to work from 8 to 5 and you're going to take a break at, you know, noon, and that's our schedule for you. And you can require them to work that schedule. If you want to allow them, hey, 8 to 5, you want to take your you know, you want to work through your lunch break, that's fine. We don't mind. What you want to watch for though is if you have employees doing that, they may end up triggering overtime on the tail end. Okay? I usually advise my clients to set out a schedule for your employees and make them work it. That way you retain control over it, you can track it, you can minimize the overtime costs, and so forth. Okay? And that's a performance issue, but it's also a business decision. If you don't care if your employees work through lunch, then great. Where there's a little bit of risk is if you have every employee is saying, well, I want to work through lunch, I want to work through lunch, me too. Okay? Because all of a sudden, it looks like there's sort of this culture that you're not allowed to take a break. I mean, if no one in the workplace is taking a meal break, it sure looks like the employer is discouraging those meal breaks. You know, you're much better situated, and I've had a lot of success fighting these claims when the person says, they said I could take a break, but you know, I knew that I couldn't really. My supervisor never would let me take a meal break. And I can come in with time cards from the 5 other employees that work next to him and say, well, this guy knew to take a break, and this one took a break, and this one took a break, and this one took a break. It looks, you know, it goes to their credibility as to whether or not that's really what the office environment is like. And that's what they're going to look at. If the employee's going to work less than 6 hours, okay, they can say, I'm not going to take my meal break. They can waive that. You don't have to allow them to do that. That's, you know, the employer and employee can agree. And if they are going to work more than 10 hours, then they get a second meal break. And you can only waive that second meal break if you've actually taken the first. Okay, you can't waive both of them. They can't say, I just want to work and work and work, and I'm on a diet and I'm going to keep working and working. Okay, whatever. They have to take that meal break. You know, I guess they don't actually have to eat during that meal break. So if they tell you they're dieting, just tell them to take their 30 minutes off and not eat anything. Okay, you have to pay them again, like I said, for all time that they actually work. Okay, but you don't necessarily have to pay that penalty unless you've done something to prevent them from taking that meal period. Okay. Where it is missed or begins after the 5th hour of work, you know, the other piece I should put in here, the other key with that meal period is that it's supposed to be 30 minutes. Okay, what we used to see before Brinker was, you know, the employee clocks out and they clock back in at 29 minutes. Oh, guess what? They didn't get a 30-minute uninterrupted duty-free meal period. Okay, all of a sudden that's not a valid meal period and that penalty got triggered. Okay, so the meal period needs to be at least 30 minutes. Okay, if they voluntarily elect to clock back in 29 minutes, okay, that's not going to trigger that penalty. But if you tell them you better be here at 1 on the dot, okay, and you know that they don't leave until, you know, whatever time, 12:31, okay, that's where that penalty would get triggered if you're the cause of that. Okay, so watch for, these are the things to watch for as we go forward after Brinker. I think these are how these meal claims are going to come up. It's the, you know, my supervisor scheduled me, there was no replacement who showed up, all those kinds. The workload was such that I couldn't possibly take a meal break. Or your policy is something where, you know, it says you need to talk to your supervisor before you can take your meal break or something along those lines. Okay. The on-duty meal period, and I get this all the time. Oh yeah, he signed off to have an on-duty meal period because, you know, he's the only guy I've got working at the store at that time. You know, you can't just have somebody say, oh yeah, I'm going to work on duty because it's more convenient, it's more cost-effective to you, employer. Okay, that on-duty meal exception is very, very limited. The example that they like to give is the security guard. Okay, if the security guard takes a 30-minute meal break, you know, guess when everybody's going to break in. Okay. So the nature of the job, the type of work is such that the person cannot possibly be relieved. If you've got somebody who's caring like a caregiver for, you know, an elderly person or something, oh yeah, I'm gonna watch them, except for 30 minutes they're on their own. Okay, that's not gonna work. If the nature of the work is such that it prevents the person from taking that meal break, then you can have them sign off on that. Okay, but it's not, even if the nature of the work is such, you're a security guard, if you're a security guard company and you have 20 other employees and you can sub somebody else in so that that person can get a break, then it may not be okay. All right, we need to look at the nature of the job and the nature of the employer, and that's how they decide, and they're very, very tight on how they construe those on-duty meal waivers. Okay, yeah.
Caregivers, what if, like, in my line of work, we work with developmentally disabled adults. And
Okay.
there's times where they end up in the hospital and they need a staff with them 24 hours
Mm-hmm.
while they're in the hospital. If we have someone working with them, let's say a 10-hour shift or 12-hour shift, but they can't leave to take a rest period, a lunch, or anything like that, what do we do in that case? Do we have to pay them the extra hour for not taking their lunch? Or what, as an employer, what do we need to provide them or accommodate them during that time?
Well, there are very specific provisions that apply in that sort of personal attendant or caregiver. It depends on which wage order you're under, 5 or 15. And that's going to sort of dictate. And that sort of spells out, okay, in the case of somebody who's a personal attendant, you have to be there, you're an in-home care person or whatever, you're at the hospital, what time is compensable and when do we get to cut stuff out? Typically that penalty is not triggered in those cases. If you've got somebody, but if you've got, I'm running a hospital and I've got these 3 people that because of the nature of their job can't do that, can't take that meal period, that's when we have them sign off on this, waiver. Okay, I understand that the nature of this job is such that I'm not able to be relieved, blah, blah, blah. And, okay, and if you have that in place. The interesting thing is the labor code or the wage orders require that waiver state specifically, I understand this, and this is an agreement that I, employee, can revoke at any time for any reason. Okay, it has to state that or that waiver is not going to be valid. If you think about it, if the employee revokes it, great. The nature of the job is still such that they can't take a meal period. So it's, I guess they just can't do that job. It doesn't really make any sense, but you want to make sure you have that magic language in there. Because I have seen meal period waivers that have been kicked out specifically because they didn't say, I can revoke this at any time.
As an employer, do we have to go and provide them a meal?
No, you don't have to bring a meal to them, no. Okay, are there other questions with that one? Okay, so you have to be paid for the time in the case if you have a valid waiver in place, okay, and they're working through that meal period, you pay them for all that time that they work, okay, but we don't pay that extra hour of pay penalty. All right, but this is one of those areas where it really is worth looking at, making sure this really is a valid on-duty meal waiver, this position really is such that the nature of the work prevents the meal period from being taken, okay, because this is an area that's pretty ripe for class actions. They like to focus on this. If you're getting it wrong for one guy, you're getting it wrong for everybody else who's under that same agreement. And I'm litigating a case right now for a guy who had a bunch of little stores, and so he had one, cashier there at each store. And so he said, well, I couldn't afford to have another person come in and work, Well, I couldn't afford it, I wanted to make more money, profit, whatever, that defense does not work, okay? Certainly you could schedule the shifts differently or sub somebody else in. There was something else that he could have probably done. Okay, the rest break obligations, and remember, meal breaks are not paid, okay? Not paid. You can pay people through the meal break. I don't usually encourage employers to pay during the meal break though, and part of that comes from, there was a case about 2 years ago that it was the restaurant Chipotle, and they paid their people during the meal break, and they actually give them food too. You can eat whatever you want from the kitchen, but because they were getting paid during that meal break, nobody clocked out on that meal period because they knew they were getting paid anyway. And so you fast forward, they get their claim and they say, well, everybody got a meal break. We paid them, of course, they're in the restaurant. They can eat whatever they want. They're getting free nachos, okay? And we pull up all the time records, and guess what? There's not a single meal period that's shown on any timesheet. And they got hit with, inaccurate time records, they got hit with no meal periods, and all that kind of stuff. So I don't usually encourage employers to pay through the meal break because it sometimes can discourage people from clocking in and out. That timesheet should show that when the meal period starts and when it ends. Okay. Rest breaks are a little different. We don't have to put those on the time card, okay, and they're paid. All right. So after Brinker, they sort of broke down when those rest breaks are owed. Okay. So after 3.5 hours, they get 10 minutes, and that 10 minutes is owed because they've worked from hour 0 to hour 4. Okay. It doesn't kick in until 3.5 hours for that first rest break. After 6 hours, they get another 10 minutes, and that 10 minutes is to cover the break for hours 4 through 8. Okay. After 10 hours, they get another 10 minutes, and that's for hours 8 to 12. It's just a rolling thing through, it could go up to 24 hours, I guess. But the idea is you get 10 minutes for every major fraction of 4 hours. A major fraction of 4 hours is more than half, and so for every 4 plus 2, that's where you get the 10-minute break. Okay.
What about the like half an hour lunch break? If you work 14 hours, what would you get your lunch?
Well,
I only see 10 minutes, 10.
what do you mean? Well, this is the rest break. The meal break is not
Oh, I
part of
see.
that. Yeah, this is just those 10-minute rest breaks. Okay. We don't have to track them again. They don't need to be on the timesheet. You pay them during this time. Okay. It can be pretty difficult for an employee, as a practical matter, to argue that they never got the rest breaks. Especially if they're a smoker, because whatever, the smokers are always outside. But as a practical matter, these ones are relatively hard to demonstrate, because you don't necessarily have the time records and so forth, unless they can bring in employees that say, they lock the doors and we were never allowed to leave or go anywhere. Okay. They stay on the premises for the rest break, but it's 10 minutes that are uninterrupted where they can, do whatever they want. Dance. I don't know what they want to do. Okay. Exempt from overtime. And I just want to touch on this briefly because this is something we're going to go into in much more depth in the next class. But if somebody's exempt from overtime, okay, we don't care about how many hours they work. All right? Because when we talk about hours worked, we're talking about how many hours do we have to actually pay for. When do those hours push you into a higher pay rate? Okay, either because you've exceeded 8 in a day or 40 in a week. That's what we're concerned about. If you've got somebody who's exempt, they're being paid on a different basis. Okay, they're either being paid on a salary, they might be being paid a commission. We don't care about those hours worked typically. Okay, so when I talk about all this stuff, meal periods, on-call, standby pay, travel pay, blah, 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 I'm referring to your non-exempt staff. Okay. That presumes, of course, that everybody who is classified as exempt actually is exempt. Okay, so you want to be careful with that. It's certainly a good idea to go back and review your exempt classifications and make sure that they actually do apply. Okay, and there's a few different considerations, and we'll talk about that next week when we look at how do you classify employees and who truly is exempt. But if you fall into one of these kinds of exemptions, we're not going to worry too much about when you work. Okay, you work as much as you want. Yeah.
Can an employer punish or write off somebody exempt for not keeping time cards?
Can you write up somebody who's exempt for not keeping a time card? Yes, if you had a policy that says, I want you to track all your time, you exempt employee, I would strongly encourage you to not have your exempt staff tracking their time. And the reason is that if that exempt person says, gee, I'm actually not exempt, they said I was exempt, they never paid me overtime, but I'm not exempt, one of the #1 things they use to prove that is the employer required me to track all of my hours, just like an hourly employee. So it's really not a good idea. I have a lot of employers that need to know what their exempt staff is working on for billing purposes, okay? And I have that in my own business as well. Have them track their billed time, that's fine. So we can pass that invoice along to the client so we know where to allocate their pay and so forth. But I don't want to know that they clocked in at 8:01. I don't want to know that they left at 4:42. Okay. The idea of being exempt is that we don't care when you do the work. We care, the end result. If you're a commission, we care how many things you sell. If you're, a salary person, we care about, the end product. You get that same amount of pay regardless. Okay. There was a case not too long ago that talked about, could you pay a non-exempt person a salary? Okay, and the labor commissioner had said, nope, can't do that. Okay, somebody fought that. It was this case, Dolores Press. They went to Superior Court. Superior Court says, of course you can pay them a salary as long as that salary covers you know, the minimum requirements for what they would make in overtime and so forth, you set out a schedule, yeah, that's fine. Okay, the courts said yes, then the legislature stepped in, and this was a new law as of January 1 of last year, and said, nope, if you pay a non-exempt person a salary, that's only going to cover those straight time hours, regardless of what great employment agreement you came up with and they signed off and everybody, you know, sealed it in blood, whatever. That's not going to be the case. It's only going to cover those straight time hours. So if you have somebody who's misclassified, okay, and they've been getting paid a salary all this time, and they've been working on the weekends because you don't care, and they've been using their phone to send email, and they've been driving to and from, you know, Office Depot for you or whatever they've been doing, all of a sudden that salary you paid them only covers the straight time hours. Not only did you not pay them the overtime, so they have the waiting time penalties, but you're going to owe them for every minute that they work beyond 8 in a day and beyond 40 in a week. So if that's the case for one employee, you know, you can see how expensive this stuff gets. Plus, every single wage statement they've gotten is incorrect because it never listed any overtime hours because they were exempt. You know, only they weren't really exempt. So it's just all of a sudden balloons up. So it's a big area. It's one of those areas where, you know, it's when we had the meal and rest period claims, and every attorney in town is just, you know, hovering over these meal and rest period claims, and that's what they're all filing, and that's what everyone's focusing on. When that went away because of Brinker, you've now got all those attorneys out there, you know, they need their next big case. They're all trying to buy Christmas presents too, okay? And so where are they going to get that money? This misclassification is one of the top, you know, big hits when it comes to class actions and to those lawsuits.
Yeah, one of my clients had, they put exempt like 5 employees that they're a drug rehab place.
Okay.
And then because they did it because they didn't want to pay them overtime.
Of course.
Everybody worked
Yeah.
12 hours.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they start getting hit with wage and hour penalties. It was like a domino effect.
Yeah.
One guy won, and then he told all his friends. Mm-hmm. Crazy.
Well, and that's the thing. You know, it is a lot cheaper to have an exempt person that you never have to pay overtime, especially if they're working 12 hours a day. You know, but the fact that you might want somebody to be exempt doesn't necessarily mean that they are, you know. And there's two pieces to that, because I had another client who said, well, we don't have any staff here. We have, you know, 12 vice presidents, okay, and they wrote up these fancy job descriptions, and it's all, you know, blah, blah, you know. And so great, they're all, you know, he's a vice president, of course he's exempt. Well, what that job description says, okay, is only 1/2 of whether or not the person's going to be exempt. You have to look at what they're actually doing. And they need to be spending more than 50% of their time actually doing exempt stuff. You know, so if I hire an administrative assistant and I give her the title of CEO and I give her a bunch of filing to do, okay, she's not going to be exempt, even though she's now the CEO of my, you know, organization. So you can't do an end run around that. The other piece of that is that employee can't do an end run by, you know, oh yeah, I'm the CEO, but guess what? I'm only going to file today. You know, there's an accountability piece on both sides. Okay, so special issues. These are the special sort of weird time. You know, we know when the person shows up for benefit, the time is generally not going to be compensable. Ooh, thank you. Okay, and what I mean by that is, you know, if I'm required to have my cell phone on me, but I can go wherever I want, I can, you know, I'm not restricted in terms of I have to be back at the office within 15 minutes if I get a call, I can drink alcohol if I'm out to dinner, whatever. Okay, if I'm not restricted and I can do what I want, probably that time is not going to be compensable. Okay. And that's that, if you have to wear a pager, you know, this shows you how old this presentation is. I don't think anybody has pagers anymore, but if you require somebody to keep their cell phone with them, you know, keep it in case the client calls you or whatever, that's probably not going to be compensable. If you tell them, okay, you're on call, if you get the call, you need to be in the office by, you know, in 30 minutes, and you need to be in your scrubs and ready to go, okay, that maybe is compensable time. All right, and if the person gets called back, okay, if they've already worked that day, you may have reporting time pay obligations because they may be coming to work more than twice in the same work day, depending on how you've defined the work day. When they get that call and come back, all that travel time driving back into the office is going to be compensable. Okay? If they get the call and they don't have to drive in, but they're on the phone, that time when they're on the phone is going to be compensable. Okay? And so this is the kind of stuff that you need, and this is really an education piece of making sure your employee understands, hey, if you get that call, you need to track that time. We need to make sure it gets noted on the time card and that you let us know. Okay? If the employee, you call the employee, they take the call, they answer the question, great. They never write it on their time card, okay? And you don't pay it because it's not on the time card, you knew. You were on the phone. And when I say you, I'm talking about any supervisor in that company, because that supervisor now puts the company on notice. I knew the person was working. They're going to be obligated to pay for that. Okay? And so this is where we get into that sort of education piece of making sure they understand how critical it is to have those time cards be accurate. Okay? And it's an ongoing battle. You know, it's not something where you do a time card training and then great, everybody does the time cards and it's perfect and you can forget about it. This is an ongoing thing you need to continually remind your workers about because it continues to be a problem, at least for most of my clients. Okay? It's like harassment or something. It's one of those things you just never get to actually check off of the to-do list. Okay, because you got to do it over and over and over and over again. Reporting time is only a state law thing. So if you're a public employer, you're not under California law, or you're exempt from the wage orders for some reason, you don't need to worry about reporting time pay. For all the rest of us, lucky California residents, we have to deal with reporting time pay. So there's 2 times when reporting time pay is going to be owed. If it's a scheduled work day, okay, and the person shows up and they get less than half of what they were scheduled for, okay, or there's no work at all, they show up and there's, oh, sorry, we already closed the deal, so you can go back home. Then you're going to end up having to pay them. It's a minimum of 2 hours up to a maximum of 4 hours. Okay, if you've got a person who works Monday through Friday, you call them in on Saturday for a special meeting, or having a safety training, okay, and you schedule it and it's only 1 hour long. As long as it's scheduled in advance, you only need to pay for that 1 hour, even though that's not their usual work day, okay, if it's scheduled in advance. If it's not scheduled in advance and you call them on Saturday morning, oh, the safety trainer's here, can you come in? Okay, that's when you would hit that reporting time. The other piece of that is if they come in on Saturday, it's scheduled in advance, but instead of lasting an hour, it only lasts 30 minutes, oh, they were furnished with less than half, or 29 minutes, I guess, less than half of the scheduled day, that would trigger reporting time pay. Okay, so make sure your trainings last at least half of the time that they're supposed to last. The other part, unscheduled work day, I don't know what that second piece is, but the other piece of that reporting time pay is when the person comes to work for the second time in a single work day. Okay? That's when you owe that additional hour of pay. Okay, there are exceptions. If there's a bomb goes off, okay, the power goes out, there's some what they call acts of God. Something that's totally beyond the control of the employer, and you have to send everybody home, the whatever. Health department comes in and says we're all breathing asbestos, we all have to leave, okay. That's not something where those reporting time penalties would get triggered. Okay. But again, this is one of those areas where a lot of employers don't realize that little reporting time piece, okay, and it seems like it's not very much. It's an hour here, 2 hours here. You're talking about, $16 per employee, but if you've got 1,000 employees and you've never been paying reporting time pay, okay, we talk about those wage penalties can go back. The penalty goes back a year, but the wage claim goes back 3 years. So it gets costly quickly. At any rate, if it's something totally beyond the employer's control, or if it's based on the power going out, you're not going to have that reporting time obligation. Travel time, and this is probably one of the top 3 questions I get all the time. Do I have to pay the guy? He used to drive to Bakersfield, now he's driving to Delano every day. What do I have to pay him for? Okay, it's a little unclear because what the labor code says and what the labor commissioner says don't exactly jive. Okay, my best advice, or my advice typically to my clients is do what the labor commissioner says. You know, even if it's not technically what the labor code says you need to do, it's going to be a lot cheaper than trying to prove the labor commissioner wrong. Eventually somebody will have, you know, deep enough pockets that they're willing to fight on that, and when they do, great, you know, the travel time rules may change a little, but for now, I would just do what the labor commissioner says. And what the labor commissioner says is that when the person goes to a different location, that's this bottom bullet, the difference between their normal commute and what they're commuting now is what they're going to need to be compensated for. So if I typically drive 10 miles to work, but now I got to drive to Fresno and I'm going 100 miles, I would get compensated for the time from, you know, for 90 miles of time, basically, okay? That's for my actual drive time. I'm not talking about the reimbursement for gas or for use of my car. I'm talking about my actual time while I'm just sitting in the car, okay? The idea is that when the person starts their first principal activity of their job, that's when their day starts, okay? We have this thing called the Portal to Portal Act, which says your job starts when you get to work, okay, not when you leave your house. So I don't need to pay somebody when they drive normally on their day to work, okay? But if I say, hey, will you bring in all the binders so that we're ready for the presentation, now when they drive to work, they're not just driving to work, they're carting something around for the employer, okay? That may start their day working. If I say, you come to work and unlock the front door so that we're all ready to open up, okay? When they open that front door, their day starts. It doesn't start 10 minutes later after they've set their stuff down and then they've clocked in, okay? And it seems like little bits of time. We're talking about a minute here, 2 minutes here, okay? At least in that LoJack case, they said 5 minutes a day over the course of a week is now 25 minutes. That's almost a half hour of pay. That's not an insignificant amount of time. So you just need to watch this, even though we're talking about little bits and pieces. There's an exception in the labor code and in the wage orders that talk about what they say de minimis time. You know, if it's a little bit of time, if it's not practical to actually track that on a timesheet or capture that time from a compensation standpoint, it's not something you need to worry about paying. What they mean by de minimis time is, you know, a second, 2 seconds. It's the on the way out the door, did that fax go through? Yeah, okay, great. I don't need you to run back in now and write 0.04 seconds, you know, because I answered the question about the fax, okay? But that's what we mean by de minimis time. We don't mean, oh, the 5 minutes it takes you to put on your uniform or to unlock the gate or whatever that case may be, okay? When we talk about travel, if you have a voluntary program, hey, everybody wants to ride on the company bus, meet here at 7:30. Okay, if it's truly voluntary and there's no expectation, no obligation, no pressure for them to take that company bus, then great, okay? That's not going to be compensable time. But if you tell them, we only want one car out on the, you know, work site, everybody needs to meet here at 7:30 and then we're all going to go together, that would then turn that time into compensable time. Yeah?
I know this is out of topic, but just curiosity, if it is voluntary and the employees get in an accident, is that covered by workers' comp?
Well, probably. There's going to be, it depends if it's a company car and that sort of thing. But generally, you know, if I'm just driving to work on my own, you know, if I crashed on the way here today, that's not going to be covered by workers' comp, okay? But if you've got somebody who's meeting at a thing, they're getting on a work bus, even though they didn't have to, you know, probably that's something that's going to fall under the purview of workers' comp. Training time, okay? Typically, where the employer benefits from that training, okay, that time is going to need to be compensated. And I get this call all the time, well, you know, they want to go, you know. Okay, yeah, sure, that's all fine and good. The way to get out of that training time is this needs to be something that's totally voluntary, okay? It's outside of work hours. It's not something that the employer is requiring or wants you to do, okay? It doesn't typically relate to your current job, you know? I've got a lot of employers who say, well, we're doing this training. They want to take the training because then they'll be certified to do this other job, okay? If you're building your own employee pool of people who are now qualified to do something that you're going to benefit from, that's probably something you're going to need to compensate them for, okay? The key is making sure it is truly, truly voluntary, okay? A lot of times we had there was a stress management workshop or something that one of my clients did, and they said, well, they don't have to go. This is, you know, whatever. employers benefiting from that. There was also kind of tied to their health care program. So I advise them to pay the employees. The other piece of that is when I say something's voluntary, okay, sort of a subjective term. And it's pretty easy for an employee to come in after the fact and say, well, they said it was voluntary, but my boss came in and told me I needed to go. And I knew that he was going to be mad, and there was an expectation for me to go. That's a pretty easy sell. It's hard to find a job right now. I don't want to make him mad. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to be the one that says, absolutely not. I refuse to go to stress training, whatever. Okay, if they get that sort of push to be somewhere, then chances are they're going to be able to argue that. And it came up again, we also had a situation where they were celebrating I talk about this in my harassment training a lot. They were celebrating a company, the deal had closed. And so the boss went around and told everybody to come to this happy hour. They're all going to, go celebrate. And so he made reservations. He told everyone to go. He went. He paid for the first round of drinks and the second round of drinks and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it turned into a really bad situation because everybody stayed and got really drunk and they were dancing, blah, blah, blah. And 2 male coworkers drove a female coworker home and raped her. And the question was, gee, is this work time? And they decided that the work time ended. He made a big fanfare of leaving. He closed out the tab. This was after the second round. I'm out of here. Thanks for coming. This was great. Okay, the work time event ended at the end of that second round. But I mean, that case could have very easily gone, the other way. So it was a scary case from the employer, but that's, you don't have that sense of, gee, this is work time, okay? But for the employee, my boss told me to go. He made reservations. He paid for it. He went around from person to person. You can see how that expectation, where I feel the push that I'm supposed to go. So that's the kind of stuff you want to watch for. You can pay a varying rate, and I should have mentioned this on travel time too. You can pay a lesser rate for the time that person spends at the training or spends traveling, okay, because they're not using those particular skills that you hired them for. All right, it needs to be at least minimum wage. You can't pay less than minimum wage, and remember, minimum wage is going to go up next summer. But right now, minimum wage is $8. So you can pay, if you want to, you pay somebody $25 an hour, but he's going to spend, 6 hours in the car, I can pay him $8 an hour for that drive time. When you do that, you have to be careful though, because now when we go back to calculate his regular rate of pay, that's going to have to be something that we factor in. There's a special formula you use, it's called the weighted average, where you merge all these different wage rates together in order to find out what did he actually make per hour. If he's getting, this amount for this hour, and this amount for this hour, and this amount for this hour. How many hours did he work, and that's how we, and so it can create a little bit of extra work from a, payroll standpoint in terms of trying to calculate how much you actually owe in overtime, but it can be a big cost saver if you've got expensive people that are either attending a lot of trainings or doing a lot of travel. There's also an option to pay what's called a learner rate, and that's for a person, their first 160 hours of doing a job that they've never done before, okay, you can pay them even at a sub-minimum wage rate, okay. Again, I think it's not really worth the headache because you got to then track those hours. When do they actually, cross over that 160-hour threshold? And for a lot of my clients, this is somebody who's maybe learning a new job at the same time they're doing their other job. So some of that time needs to be paid at their regular rate, and some can be paid at the learner rate. It's just hard to track, and I don't know that it's worth what you save. Okay, then we have vacation, PTO, holidays, all that kind of stuff. You have no obligation at all, with one small exception, to provide paid time off. Okay, you don't have to provide holiday pay, you don't have to provide sick pay, you don't have to provide a vacation, you don't have to give PTO, bereavement leave. You don't have to give any of that if you don't want to. The one exception is organ and bone marrow leave. Okay, if you've got somebody who's donating an organ or is donating bone marrow, that is a paid leave obligation that's imposed by statute on private employers. Okay, you have to pay for that time off. They get up to 5 days of paid leave for bone marrow and up to 30 days of paid leave for, I think it's 30 days, for an organ. Okay, whether you have people that are going to abuse that system, I seriously doubt. How bad do you want a vacation? You're willing to sell your kidney for it. But that's the single paid leave obligation that California employers have when it comes to, or private employers have in California. Most employers, however, do have a sick leave program, holiday pay, however they want to structure that. And I have, there's sort of two schools of thought. Some people use just PTO. You have one leave bank, you can use it for whatever you want. Okay, I don't care if you're sick, I don't care if you want to go on vacation. This is your PTO, you get 2 weeks a year, do with it what you will. Okay. The downside to that is if it's just straight PTO, it's going to be considered deferred wages. Okay, that means as they accrue that time and they haven't used it, when they quit or they're fired, all that unused time is wages that needs to be paid out. So at the end of their employment, you need to pay for all of that PTO. Okay, that's the downside to that. If you break it up as vacation and sick pay is not considered deferred wages. Okay, so when they leave and they quit or fired, whatever, and they have 10 sick days on the book, we don't have to pay out for any of that. That's not wages. They're not entitled to that time. Their right to that pay only accrues at the time when they actually are sick and call in. So we don't need to pay for that. So that can be sort of a cost saver. If you don't want to have to pay for that time off, at the end when their employment ends, then you may want to carve it out as sick time. The downside to carving it out as sick time is if you give everybody 10 sick days, guess how many times they're sick during the year, Yeah. So if you have, a situation where, you want to really kind of cut that down and have your people at work, then it's better typically to use PTO as opposed to a vacation slash sick pay program. Paid holidays are like sick time. They're not considered to be deferred wages. You don't need to pay that out when they leave. They leave in December 1st. You don't need to pay them for the December holiday that they would have gotten had they stayed. Okay, that only accrues if they're there working on the day of that holiday, if you have that in place. If you have floating holidays, okay, unless it's anchored to a specific date, that's going to be considered deferred wages. That's going to be like vacation. Hey, you get your birthday off. Okay, if it's anchored to a specific date, it's going to be considered a holiday. You don't get it unless you're working on your birthday. Okay, but if they say, hey, once you've been here a year, you get a floating holiday, you can take a day off whenever you want as your anniversary day or your birthday day or whatever you want to take it as. If it's not anchored to any specific date on the calendar, that's going to be considered a vacation day and you're going to need to pay that out. Okay, those are some of the pieces that get a little forgotten. Okay, and then again, you pay that time according to whatever your policy or plan is. Okay, this comes up also if you've got people that are working alternative work week schedules. Because if I'm not working on my, the holiday is on my 4/10 day when I would have worked 10 hours, do I get 10 hours of holiday pay or do I get 8 hours of holiday pay? Okay, and those are all things that you need to work out in your policies, in your, manual, your handbook that you disclose to the people, and then you pay accordingly. The key is we don't want to pay people differently. Okay, we want it to be consistent across the board, and we want to be very clear and upfront about what time is actually going to get compensated for. Okay, I think that's most of our stuff. Oh, we need to go through the time cards and timesheets. Remember we talked about earlier, any time that you're under the control of that employer, that's going to be the compensable time. Okay, key is making sure you get that employee to clock in and clock out. I have a lot of clients that deal with issues where the employee is afraid, okay, to write down the accurate time because they were 5 minutes late, okay, or they're 5 minutes early and they know that they don't, the employer doesn't want them to trigger any overtime, okay. This is an education thing. You can round in 5, 10, 15-minute increments. Well, 15 minutes under federal law, but 5 or 10-minute increments under state law. So if the person if it's 7:58, okay, you can round up to 8 o'clock. That's fine. All right. You can't round, up in the morning and then down in the evening, or whatever, always to the detriment of the employee. You have to round fairly, okay. But as long as you have a standard practice, and it may benefit the employee sometimes, it may benefit the employer sometimes, that's fine and that's fair. This is an education issue. I don't want to see a timesheet that says, I got here at 8, I left at 12, got back at 1, left at 5, 8, 12, 1, 5, 8, 12, 1, 5. That's not accurate. Nobody arrives at exactly 8.0000 every single day, okay? When you show up, and I've seen this happen in labor commissioner hearings, when you show up with those time records, here they are, okay? And they say, oh, 8, 8, 8, 8, 8, 8, 8, huh, yeah, they throw them out. It's the same as not having time records. It's not accurate. That's not going to be valid. It's not going to carry any weight. Okay. There's lots of things you can do, whether it's, a time clock or punch in or GPS on somebody's car, whatever, ways to track that time. But the key is we want it to be accurate. It should say 7:51, 7:59, 8:20, 8:02, whatever. Plus it gives you an idea of, you can look and see which employees are actually showing up to work when they need to. Okay, it gives you an idea of who's following your policies. Okay, they have to be in ink or in some other indelible form. You don't have to have time clocks, okay, and then you need to retain those time records for at least 3 years. All right, so that's the other one where, oh shucks, we only have time cards going back 6 months, okay? And I had this happen for a client where they had a great client defense to this claim that came up, but guess what? They had timesheets that went back 6 months. They didn't want to open the door and let that out that they didn't have any of their records, and so they ended up having to pay out on a claim to settle it that they could have fought and won. And that really stings, when you've got this great defense and you really have done everything right, but oh shucks, we don't have, we're going to open up a bigger can of worms over here if we let the labor commissioner know that we don't have any of our other stuff in place. So that's what you really want to try to avoid. Make sure that they're accurate, okay? If that timesheet doesn't come in, all right, how much do I pay a person for? I don't know how many hours they worked. You pay them for whatever they were scheduled. Pay them for what you reasonably thought they worked. Pay them for what they usually work. Don't delay that paycheck just because the time card didn't come in, okay? Pay them, call them in. You need to submit your time card. This is a performance issue. You write them up and counsel them. That is not okay. All right? You don't need to pay them for overtime in that pay period. If they don't turn in their time card, you don't need to pay for the overtime in that pay period. You can wait until the following week, okay, to pay that. Or if they say, well, shucks, I didn't turn in my time card because I was, slaving away in overtime hours, okay, you can pay those the following week. You do need to pay for that time that they actually work, but don't hold that paycheck hostage, okay, because it's going to end up costing you a lot more. If there are minor discrepancies, oh yeah, go ahead.
What happens if employees don't write down their time and then payroll passes by and 2 or 3 days later they call you, oh, you didn't pay me, I need my check right now. Is there a time frame that we have to get back to them?
Well, you should have paid them on the payday. So, yeah, so I would,
If they forget to write down the time that they work.
even if they forget to write down the time that they work, you still are supposed to pay them on the payday if you knew or reasonably should have known that they were working at that time. So regardless of whether, if you both work for me and now it's the payday and I go, oh shucks, I don't have a time card from either one of you, I still need to go and generate a paycheck for you, okay? And I need to generate that paycheck based on either what you were scheduled or what I know that you worked, what you usually worked. I need to come up with my best good faith estimate of what those hours are and pay you, okay? And then,
We'll ask for the time card.
pardon?
We'll ask them for the time card.
Yeah, we'll ask them for the time card. But if you don't have any way of getting it, or you're at that deadline, we got to cut the checks right now, I don't know the hours, what I'm saying is don't delay on paying. Come up with some way to calculate what you think you should pay them or what you think they are owed, and then call them in and get mad at them. And we can recoup and figure out that where, if we overpaid you or underpaid you, we can figure that out on the next paycheck. But here's the deal, that time card needs to be in. And if they continue to do that and not turn in the time card, we fire them. They're not a good worker. They're not following your policies. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. But when they call and say, shucks, I didn't get my paycheck 2 days ago, that's when you run and write the check as fast as you can because you're already late. So there's already that level of exposure. Trying to get those employees to turn in the time card is probably one of, if not the top issue that employers have. I don't know why it's so difficult, but it's in every single industry. It's in every single, it's just nobody. And even in my own, business where we have to bill by the hour, nobody does their time. It's just something that, we're genetically not,
In my situation, we have different supervisors.
Mhm.
Supervisors collect timesheets, check them, sign them, and they bring them to me.
Okay,
So then I go out with the supervisor.
Yeah. Because,
on
yeah,
that one, right? And they say, okay, everything's accurate, everything's correct.
Great.
2 or 3 days later, I have an angry employee calling me. I didn't get paid for this day, for this day, for this day.
yeah. Well,
I want my check.
then you write your check. You write the check to the employee.
That's what
Okay. You call that supervisor in and say, you need to have those accurate time cards. Okay. Then you call the supervisor. Then calls the employee in and says, you need to give me this time Because when you don't give me the time, and then I don't get the time, we're both now in trouble, okay? That's where that's a management performance issue. That supervisor is not staying on that employee to get the time. And that supervisor may need to understand that if a time card doesn't come in, I still have an obligation to pay. So it may be a training and education issue of you still, if you've got somebody who you know was working, whether they give you a time card or not, we're still paying them on the payday, because that's when they're entitled to their wages. And if they have to wait for those wages, we've now triggered waiting time penalties. We've triggered, the wage statement issue because they didn't get a wage statement on the payday. We've triggered, so that's where those penalties build up. So it may be worth sitting down with your supervisors, whoever provide those timesheets to you, and just making sure they understand whether you get the timesheet or not, we're paying these people, okay? And we'll go back and square up and calculate where we overpaid or underpaid, but we're still going to pay them on the payday. So you need to let me know every single person that's working, If you do have those mistakes, that's where you sit down, okay, you need to sign off, this was a mistake, you were overpaid or underpaid and so forth, and then we can go about recouping that. You can sometimes recoup some of that from the future payments, but you got to be really careful with that, especially if we talk about a final paycheck, trying to, recover monies, debts that the employee may owe you. Okay, and we talked about rounding practices. You can round in those different increments, but you just want to make sure, you don't get to always, I get round down in the morning and up in the evening so that you pay less. All right, are there other questions? Okay, well, thank you guys. Next week is hour basics, I think, and then we go into overtime. Fun stuff.